Apple has had their September 2020 event this week, at which they announced 2 brand new products. Well, 4 in total. So we got 2 new Apple Watches and also 2 new iPads. We've actually covered the Apple Watches in a separate video covering 30 things you probably didn't know. And in this one, I'll be talking about, well, the 2 new iPads, the iPad 8 and the iPad Air 4. So without any further ado, get that popcorn ready, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Right, so I'm going to start off with the iPad 8th generation. So the first thing that I want to mention here is probably the most valuable one, and that's the fact that this is an incredible deal. It's so worth it. So this iPad costs $329 or 329 pounds. It comes with a 10.5-inch display, an Apple A12 processor, and for this price, by the way, this is actually cheaper than Apple Watch Series 6, which costs $400 or 380 pounds. I know, makes zero sense how an iPad does so much more and, you know, the components are also more expensive. At the end of the day, it's actually more expensive to buy an Apple Watch. So if you're looking to get a new iPad and you don't know which one to get, this one is very likely the one for you. So what about the iPad mini? You know, the iPad mini is still being sold, and it's actually more expensive at $400 when compared to $329 of the iPad 8. Well, the mini comes with the same specs, so the same A12 processor, and a smaller display. That makes no sense. Why is the mini more expensive? Well, there are a few things that the mini actually offers that the iPad 8th generation doesn't. Aside from the larger display, really the only advantage that you get with the iPad 8th generation is that smart connector, which the mini lacks. What this means is that you can actually buy Apple's Smart Keyboard, which uses the smart connector. You don't need any batteries for that, and you use it with the iPad 8th generation. As this iPad actually has the exact same design as the iPad Pro from 2017, only with a slightly smaller display. But other than that, the iPad mini does have quite a few advantages. For example, we get 32GB as the baseline storage and up to 128GB on the iPad 8th generation versus 64GB as the baseline and up to 256GB on the iPad mini. Then the iPad 8th generation is also quite thick. At 7.5mm thick, the iPad 8 is the thickest iPad that Apple currently sells, the mini itself being quite thin at just 6.1mm. Now, in my opinion, the biggest disadvantage of this iPad, the iPad 8th generation, is the fact that the display is not laminated with the glass. So what this means is that you'll actually see a very thick layer, essentially a gap in between the glass and the actual display, sort of like having a very thick screen protector. All the other iPads, by the way, are laminated, and they have been since the iPad Air 2 from 2014. The only exception has been this entry-level iPad line. And then we also get a few more display downgrades over even the iPad mini. For example, we have no anti-reflective coating. We have no white color P3 display. We have no True Tone display, which all of these, the mini and the Air, they all have those. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, definitely consider becoming a subscriber and also tapping on that bell icon, because we'll have way more videos like this one coming in the near future. Oh, and it's, you know, also free to subscribe. Now, there are a few camera downgrades that this iPad 8th generation comes with. For example, there's no wide color support for photos or live photos. The front camera is only 1.2 megapixels versus 7 megapixels on the mini and all the other iPads, so front camera quality is pretty bad. Also, you can only do 720p video on the front 30 versus 1080p video on the front with all the other iPads. And there's also no auto HDR, so if you want to take a photo with HDR, you have to manually toggle that thing on. We also only have Bluetooth 4.2 as opposed to Bluetooth 5.0 on all the other iPads. There's also no Wi-Fi 6 on the iPad 8th Gen, so we only have Wi-Fi 802.11 AC. And all the other iPads, so the iPad Air 4 and the iPad Pro 2020, they have Wi-Fi 6. Now, the main reason why you would care about Wi-Fi 6 is if you also have a Wi-Fi 6 router. In that case, you can get just amazing coverage with a router and a Wi-Fi 6 device, but other than that, you wouldn't really notice that much of a difference. The Wi-Fi speeds will be a bit slower, topping up at 866 megabits per second compared to 1.2 gigabits per second, which is what we would get on the iPad Air and all the other iPads, but again, this is still a very, very high speed. Speaking of speeds, the LTE speeds are a bit lower. So we still get gigabyte class LTE on the iPad 8th generation, however, we only get 27 bands compared to 30 bands on the iPad Air and the iPad Pro, which means that you might have some trouble getting faster speeds on some networks. And one last thing that I want to mention here regarding the iPad 8th generation is that it also supports an eSIM, which means that you can actually just go into settings and buy a virtual SIM from there. So you don't actually have to go to a store and buy a SIM card, you can just do it from the settings, which is really, really cool. And this also works on the iPad Air 4 and the iPad Pros as well. Now, I know that I've mentioned quite a few downsides to this entry-level iPad, but at the end of the day, this is an amazing deal. This is cheaper than the Apple Watch Series 6, and again, it's a full iPad with the Apple A12 processor, which is the same chip as the iPhone XS. So it's a very powerful device, and you can do basically anything with that. You know, you can attach a keyboard, the Smart Keyboard, the Apple Pencil, and so much more. So it's a great, great device. Link for that iPad in the description. So let's move on to the iPad Air 4. So as you can probably tell, the iPad Air 4 looks very similar design-wise to the iPad Pro 2018. However, it's not actually identical. I think that the first thing that you will notice design-wise is that the iPad Air 4 actually comes with some new colors. So it comes in rose gold, which is a first. It comes in green, which is again a first for this style in terms of the design, and also sky blue, which I absolutely love. The Pro, for example, the Pro only comes in silver and space gray. However, the iPad Air is actually thicker than the iPad Pro at 6.1mm compared to 5.9. Now, the display is also a bit smaller on the iPad Air. So we have a 10.9-inch panel on the iPad Air versus an 11-inch panel on the iPad Pro, which is really strange, like a 0.1-inch difference. Now, because of this, the bezels are actually slightly larger on the iPad Air. And I honestly have no idea why Apple decided to do this, because it's surely more expensive to just manufacture a completely new display than to just buy more of those iPad Pro displays, and then you can just remove that 120Hz display controller so that you have a 60Hz panel. Anyways, really strange. Now, the upgrades that the iPad Pro has in terms of the display are basically the following. One, you get a ProMotion display, so 120Hz refresh rate, so everything is really smooth. Obviously, the Apple Pencil is way more fluid because of that. And then the brightness is a tiny bit higher, so you have 600 nits on the iPad Pro versus 500 on the iPad Air. Interesting enough, the iPad Air is actually lighter than the iPad Pro, coming in at 458 grams versus 471. So this should actually be quite noticeable if you're coming from an iPad Pro. I don't see why you would, at least from 2018, but it is lighter. And the iPad Air 4 also comes with a brand new Apple Pencil, the second gen, as opposed to the first gen like the previous iPad Air supported. So now we have the same Apple Pencil support as the iPad Pros. Whereas the iPad 8th generation that I talked about before, that one only supports the first generation Apple Pencil. Yeah, I know, the names are like so confusing now with, iPad 8th gen, Apple Pencil 1st, 2nd gen, super confusing. I think Steve is just rolling in his grave. The iPad Air, same as the iPad 8th generation, also has a smart connector, but because of the position of that smart connector being on the back, and the fact that, we now get a squared off form factor, it actually supports the Magic Keyboard, just like the iPad Pro does, as opposed to just the Smart Keyboard like the iPad 8th generation does. Now, interesting enough, when it comes to the camera, the back-facing camera, this is almost identical to the one on the 2018 iPad Pro. So it's the same sensor, 12 megapixels, the same f1.8 aperture. Really, the only difference is that the 2018 iPad Pro has a quad LED True Tone flash module, which the iPad Air lacks. So what this means is that really the most useful feature about a flash is when you want to use it as a torch at night. So you cannot do that on the iPad Air. Compared to the 2020 iPad Pro, we have no ultra-wide-angle module and no LiDAR module, but I wouldn't really say that these two are actually useful to have or that useful for the average user, so I think the camera on the iPad Air is way more than enough. Now, here's a big one. There's no Face ID on the iPad Air, so this is the biggest downgrade from the iPad Pro. So unlocking is now done via a Touch ID sensor built into the power button, which is now larger. Now, I'm not fully sure if we have tap to wake. It's fully unclear at this point. There was no mention of this at the Apple event, so I really hope that it does have tap to wake, because having to find a specific button on the top of a large tablet to just, open up the display and wake it from sleep, I think that's so frustrating. And did you guys know that the iPad Air, in some ways, is actually more powerful than the 2020 iPad Pro? So it comes with an Apple A14 chip, compared to the Apple A12Z inside the 2020 iPad Pro, which is just an A12X from the 2018 iPad Pro with one enabled GPU core, that's it. So the A14 has a more powerful CPU than the A12Z, however, the GPU is actually a bit weaker. Now the A14 is actually the very first CPU, or SoC in this case, to be based on a 5nm process, which is really, really impressive. It comes with 6 CPU cores, 4 energy efficient and 2 high performance cores, and it is 40% more powerful CPU-wise than the iPad Air 3's A12 chip, and 30% faster GPU-wise than the iPad Air's A12 chip. So as you can probably see, the improvements over the A13 aren't that great in this case, just about 10 to 20%. Now, we still get some really interesting features, such as a 16-core neural engine that supports 11 trillion operations per second. And for example, in this app in DJ, you can actually just hold your hands in the air and you can just scrub through the records in the air, and everything is just done by that neural engine, which is really, really impressive. Apple also compared the Apple A14 chip against some of the best-selling Windows laptops, Chromebooks, and even Android tablets on the market, and the iPad Air 4 was actually significantly faster than all of these, and it's also significantly thinner. The iPad Air also comes with USB-C, finally. The iPad 8th generation still uses Lightning, and if you take a look at the box itself, we actually get a 20-watt USB-C power adapter in the box. And thanks to USB-C, we also get 4K monitor output support, apparently, up from just 1080p via Lightning. Now, scaling is still pretty bad, and there's still no multiple monitor support, so yeah, it's not great, but it's getting there. Speaking of 4K, we do have 4K video recording on the back, 4K 60 actually, versus 1080p 30 on the iPad 8th generation. So there's a massive upgrade here if you're coming from the iPad 8th generation and you're interested in that back-facing camera. In terms of the speakers, we have a dual speaker setup, so one on the top, one on the bottom on the iPad Air, compared to 4 speakers on the iPad Pro. So 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom, which could be the reason why the iPad Air is actually lighter, because it actually lacks 2 speakers. Okay, so here's the thing, the iPad Air is actually a very good tablet. It's almost identical to the iPad Pro in, almost every single way, and in some ways, CPU-wise, it is actually more powerful. So who should actually buy the iPad Pro? Keep in mind that the iPad Air costs $600 and the iPad Pro costs $800. So what advantage do you actually get by buying an iPad Pro? Well, we actually get more baseline storage. So we get 128GB on the iPad Pro versus 64 on the iPad Air 4. And we also get a higher storage option, up to 1TB on the iPad Pro versus up to 256GB on the iPad Air. So if you need a lot of storage and you're, doing mobile video editing on the iPad, then definitely get a Pro. If you care about AR apps, then the iPad Pro is again a better choice because it has that LiDAR module. If you care about a camera, it also has an ultra-wide-angle module, which is really useful for, especially taking video with that cinematic wide-angle camera. The iPad Pro is also a tiny bit thinner. Now, when it comes to that CPU, this is where it gets a bit tricky. So the GPU is actually 8-core on the iPad Pro versus 4-core or quad-core on the iPad Air. So on the GPU side, the iPad Pro is actually quite a bit better. Now on the CPU side, we have an 8-core CPU on the iPad Pro versus a 6-core CPU on the iPad Air. So the A12X is actually more powerful in terms of multi-core and the GPU, whereas the A14 is actually more powerful in terms of single-core. We also get more RAM on the iPad Pro, 6GB of RAM versus 4GB on the iPad Air. So again, if you do a lot of multitasking, then the iPad Pro is going to be the best choice. Not even to mention ProMotion display, that 120Hz panel, the more fluid Apple Pencil. We also get Face ID, which I would say is actually the biggest difference, and emojis. We get those on the iPad Pro. And portrait mode selfies on the front, which you cannot do on the iPad Air. Interesting enough, the iPhone SE 2020 actually does support portrait mode selfies on the front, even though it doesn't have the Face ID hardware required. So Apple managed to do it through software, but for some reason they've disabled this on the iPad Air, probably just to, convince you to buy the iPad Pro instead. So it's quite obvious that the iPad Air 2020 at the moment is actually worth it more than the 2020 iPad Pro. So I think the real question is it worth buying an iPad Air, or is it actually worth finding a 2018 iPad Pro instead? And I would say, yeah, definitely get an iPad Pro 2018 instead, because you get Face ID, 120Hz, and pretty much all the improvements that I mentioned before in the 2020 iPad Pro, aside from that LiDAR module and the ultra-wide-angle lens. But yeah, let me know in the comments, what do you guys think about both of these iPads? Check out the video that we've done on the Apple Watch with 30 things you probably didn't know. Definitely subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. And yeah, this has been pretty much it for this video. So thank you for watching. This has been ZONEofTECH. I'm Daniel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. ZONEofTECH, signing out.